All right, this is a final presentation for the book club for Essential Poker Math. We're just getting right into it. Chapter 16 had some issues with the Zoom call earlier, so this is just kind of a solo recording. I'm going to run through the chapters like we did in the past, a little bit of discussion questions we were talking about. But Chapter 16 gets off starting about bluffs and hero calls. And, it runs into some of the math. Some of the math down here is basically just right in this little table. It's all you really need to know is what the point of this chapter is that certain bet sizes have certain frequencies where the bettor must win at a certain size and the caller must win that. And that's kind of like the math that you should know. You should be able to calculate that and you should be able to kind of understand that. But understanding the math doesn't really kind of actually change some of what are natural human tendencies. Like a lot of people basically start tilting like crazy, even though they may realize that you only need to be right about a third of the time. If you're bluff catching, a full pot size bet, or if you're bluffing half pot, you only need to be right about a third of the time. So we should be losing when we're making bluffs and hero calls. It's a big part of kind of the understanding the human psychology around basically this math is we are meant to be losing when we're doing these things. We're meant to be losing more often than we're meant to be correct, but that still means that we're going to be correct and we're doing it correctly, even if it seems like we're losing, more than half the time. So that kind of is something that we can work into our favor, right? We can put people into spots where they're likely to be overfolding, maybe large bluffs on the river or other nodes that may not be defended properly, because we can work human tendencies into being, more risk averse. Generally people under bluff, right? Across all nodes. That's something we've kind of established. People, for the most part, under bluff, and they under call because it's really, really painful. So even though we understand the math, what really comes down to it is human tendencies get in the way of that. It causes a lot of issues of tilt. And just knowing the math doesn't mean that, there's not all these other caveats and considerations about when it's best to bluff and bluff catch. And the book doesn't really go into that other than talking about sort of general tendencies of, of course, textures and ranges and stakes and villains are all things that are going to matter a lot when it comes down to what is appropriate to bluff catch. So the when and the why is always kind of going to be more different and dependent on the actual hand itself, even though the math is always going to be the same. And so, yeah, you just, think about where you may be at the start of your poker journey. A lot of people either kind of like way over bluff and way over call, and then they start learning about the poker math and like, oh crap, they got to be, they start folding way more. They want to play tighter, they want to play better and everything like that. Eventually people start bluffing a lot less because they become primarily maybe value bettors. So you're going to have a different relationship to bluffing and hero calling throughout your poker journey from the start to beginning. And trying to find that balance along the way is really important because the quicker you get more comfortable in these areas is generally going to be very profitable for you, because a lot of people will just misplay these spots in a lot of directions, either over or under. And so there's a lot of opportunity there when other people are constantly kind of misplaying them. So chapter 17 moves on into expected value calculations. And expected value is just basically our expected winnings minus our expected losses. We've talked about this before. It's our equity in the probability of that kind of happening and the money going in with that probability and how often we win versus how often we lose. And expected value can be measured in the moment, but it's really kind of like a long-term thing that we consider because there's always variance and probabilities are going to change. So at the end of the day, we're trying to become long-term expected value winners. And so how do we do that? We do that through solid in-game decisions and then finding plus EV strategies and sort of like logical simplifications that we can do. Basically everything in one of Alton's main points of the book and just poker in general, is that long-term EV is really all that matters, and what we should kind of trying to be optimizing for. Um, and so, if you keep that framework, if you're already thinking long term, you're going to be tilting less, and you're just going to have a better focus on how to do a lot of these things. So, one of the things that's just kind of important to realize that gets talked about is the money in the pot is already gone when you're facing a call. Some people fall into a sunk cost fallacy where they've already maybe put $100 in, and it's like another $100 to call, and they're thinking that their call right there in that point is like a $200 call, but it's really just a $100 call that comes to them because money in the pot that they've already put in is already gone. That's already gone. So Alton wanted to make that distinction there. It's just a natural kind of sunken cost fallacy that people fall into, but we should definitely be aware of that when we're considering EV decisions. So one of the discussion questions that I was talking about is, can you explain how and what a simplification might be using the EV formula? And so I guess kind of one of the most obvious things is that when we start introducing a lot of different maybe sizes, is that every time we do all these different sizes and start splitting ranges, there's going to be different probabilities of winning, and different bet sizes, which is dollar amounts. So you're just adding in a lot more factors into the EV equation. So simplifications there in that point could maybe always be to always just check the node. Like say you're the PFR out of position, small blind versus big blind. Maybe you always just start with a check on the flop, or you're in position and you're the three better, and so maybe you always just bet range on whatever flop. And you can kind of see in your head, if you have this understanding of what the EV formula is, if you start removing all these like variables and complexities and all these parts of like the X's and Y's of the equation, you're going to reduce at more simplification, which should be kind of obvious once you start thinking in terms of what the EV formula actually looks like. And so moving on, that's kind of what the point is about semi-bluffing is. Semi-bluff is an additional parameter that we add into like the EV equation, right? Because if you're semi-bluffing, it's a bet there, and the probability of that person folding becomes kind of one part of the equation, where the probability of them calling and you winning becomes another, and you just lose out in the times where they call and then their equity, they're ahead by the river. So it talks about we should definitely understand how to use EV both on the table, off the table, how it applies when we add in more variables, like when we're semi-bluffing or having different bet sizes. It's very important that we start thinking in terms of EV. Equity is kind of like that precursor, and then EV is really kind of how we measure dollar results. So it's really important to start understanding EV better. Moving on to chapter 18, which is combinatorics. Combinatorics becomes really, really important in poker because it helps us understand what a range may look like. And that range is a sum of all the possible kind of hand combinations that a person can have in that spot. And so we can only know basically what those hand combinations are by, developing that range and seeing what the board is. And we really need to learn about, all the different kind of unsuited combinations and pair combinations that there are. And just, we should be able to assess and do some of this stuff pretty quickly in our head. Maybe it's easier to do value combinations than it is bluff combinations. That was one of the discussion questions. But for the most part, people, I would say, can count value combinations pretty quickly, right? And Alton talks about using the 3-2-1 rule for that. The 3-2-1 rule is that when talking about pairs, there are 6 combinations of any pair. So there's 6 ace-aces, 6 king-kings, down to 2 twos. And so the 3-2-1, whenever we see one of those cards, we take away one of the numbers from the pairs. So if there are 6 aces and we have an ace in our hand, at most the opponent can have 3 combinations. We take away a 3, and so that's 2 plus 1 equals 3, where before they had it all available. 3 plus 2 plus 1 equals 6. So then if we have an ace and another ace is on the flop, right, we have two that we're taking away. So we take away a three and a two. That means there's only one more combination of aces out there. So that's, a good mental math kind of way to quickly figure out how many potential overpairs there are out there and how many sets there are. And that's one of the reasons why kind of value betting combos is maybe a little bit easier to do, because you know what's on the board and you know maybe how to quickly add up those pairs and overpairs and sets and two pairs, where maybe it's a bit more difficult to assess bluffing combinations because we don't exactly know what that range could be, and villains bluff with different combinations. Even being off by, say, villain always bluffs with ace five off, that's, maybe an additional 16 combinations that we're always adding into a bluffing range that we didn't realize and know was there because that was villain dependent. So it's really important that we start basically knowing how to count value combos just naturally, and then giving a good assessment of what bluff combinations are along the way. Of course, things like blockers and card removal matter a lot when we start doing that. It kind of shows how board interactions really work. And it matters a lot for our own ranges and river ranges and everything like that. It especially becomes valuable on the river when we're bluffing really strongly. Having, blockers to the nuts basically allows us to maybe either call wider or bluff more aggressively. One single blocker, like having an ace of club when there's clubs on board to a club flush, can then block out your opponent from having all those ace-x combos while allowing you to have all those ace-x combos. So one card removed from there can massively change ranges to the tune of like 10 plus combos in either direction. So starting to pay more attention to the combinatorics of blockers and unblockers becomes really important along your poker journey. Before we had solvers to kind of balance all this stuff, what people would do, Doug Polk, I guess, was a good example. Before solvers in the heads up game tree, he would just run through all these different boards and see, he would say, hey, my range at this point, I have this many value bets, and then you kind of work backwards. That means I need this many combinations of bluffs at this point for these size bets and everything like that. Well, how do I then construct a range that has a balanced amount of bluffs? All right, well, you need this many. So you then need to figure out what are the best hands to slot into that from your range. And before GTO was kind of like doing that and figuring out all the things that were kind of like nice and best to do in this, the way to work backwards was to kind of figure out what the bet sizes and what the particulars were at any node was, and then to kind of like fill in the bluffs to value bets through combinatorics. So thankfully, we have GTO to make it all both really difficult and easy to do for that. That kind of comes towards more of the conclusion of the book. We ran through all the chapters. We got a taste of these kind of like post-flop heuristics towards the end, which is really great. We understand a little bit better about EV and combinatorics, but most of this book was to give us the framework for how to make equity decisions and pot odds and understand implied odds. And basically, at the end of the day, it was, giving us a framework for how to compute EV and to push us in the direction of making more plus EV decisions. So, I think the exercises were really valuable. If people did them, I didn't cover them a lot in this series of how to actually, compute what these things were. Super important. But I hope this is a nice kind of discussion and overview to the book club. And that was the first one, and we'll kind of move on from there. So thanks for being here with me for doing that. And that was the very first book, Essential Poker Math by Alton Hardin.